Cool. So, welcome everyone. My name is James Fanboy, and tonight is our financial political education workshops. And we are joined by Homero Radway. Homero is the Senior Analyst with Activist. And during this workshop, we are going to be, our presenter is going to be providing an overview of pilots and their use in generating revenue for local governments. They'll also discuss the potential impact of pilots on communities, including the benefits and challenges of implementing them. Our presenters will share their insights and experience in working with communities to implement pilots in a way that promotes social and environmental impact. To give you guys more context to who our guest is, Humaro is, as I mentioned, senior analyst with Activest. He has 20 years of financial experience connecting people through stories and communities with capital. His recent financial experience includes managing director at Neighborly. He has also worked at JP Morgan, Morgan Stanley, Rowe Price, Credit Suisse, and Lehman Brothers. Homero has an MBA from Georgetown University and a BS from Cornell University. Thank you and welcome, Homero, today.
Thank you. I definitely want this to be a dialogue. So as we speak, please feel free to ask me any questions, jump in, comments. I heard you guys do that anyway, so we'll be easy. I think I wanted to start by, one of the parts that I have played a role in is underwriting infrastructure projects for different cities and coming in and trying to help to figure out a solution for how to get to it. And pilots often come up in that, particularly because so many cities want to find a way to give subsidies to corporations to come in for whatever reason and build up some kind of higher economic tax base, right? Either from property taxes or income taxes. And pilots just have been a kind of for a long time, relatively easy way to go about doing that. And so just to give a little background on what a pilot is and payment in lieu of taxes. And the idea behind a pilot is that, you want to develop a particular area and the taxes that are currently there, or the tax base that is currently there, is going to be higher when the economic development happens in the future. And so the corporation or whatever the entity is makes the agreement with the government or the municipality or residents, really, that they will pay some sort of fee, but not what the property taxes would have been for that area in order to develop it. And that is called the payment in lieu of the taxes. So instead of paying what the property taxes would be, they pay a smaller amount, really as kind of a subsidy or a kickback to a corporation or a developer in order to go ahead and develop an area. I think some of the challenges and some of the benefits, I think the challenges really are, unfortunately, really long. But I think one of them is that the racism that exists in how we evaluate which communities that is just is steeped in the whole process, So the idea that this area may have lower income directly relates back to, really oppressing people that are poor, and then particularly really picking on marginalized and Black people. And you can just see that happening throughout the country in different models where the tax abatements or the pilot agreements all are happening in places that really people don't have a strong enough voice, or have really, I think, a lack of information purposefully in order to stop pilots from happening, in order to not give away those property taxes now, because this idea that this area needs some kind of economic development to get back to parity of income with the rest of an area or city or state. And so I find it how those places are picked is just so is based on not a lot of care. Some of the work I've done is trying to analyze what that development and displacement looks like. And so we've done some work in Louisville, working with Root Cause Research Center, and just figuring out how many people got displaced when they did an economic development project like this in Louisville, in the Russell neighborhood, which is kind of the West Louisville historically Black neighborhood. And then realizing that part of the agreement that Louisville was making to offer pilot agreements to both Churchill Downs and the developer of that area, part of that agreement was the driver of the ordinances that then led to Breonna Taylor's death. And so like the ramifications of this, of how like policing is then used on that economic development and the subsidies given to the corporation, and it's all because this area is considered to be blighted or without high income, I find to be like hugely problematic. I would say, I was trying to, the successes. I have seen communities really trying to have a different conversation around the arts. And I've seen this in Kansas City and some other places where cities are really trying to think about how do we use a pilot agreement on an already existing property. So it's a private developer with their own empty land that they have not developed, and then paying a pilot, which to me makes sense, right? Like that's theirs and they should pay for those taxes in order to get to a place of being able to develop that, but figuring out a place in the meantime to continue to collect taxes for a property. We've seen some research where like cities have estimated, I think Baltimore has done some studies of like $120 million they gave away in foregone taxes in pilots. And that's just on an annual basis. And then, for example, the Louisville research we did, something we figured out was like even Churchill Downs was getting subsidies in terms of pilots, right? So it's just, to me, I think abused in many ways. And yeah, not a lot of models that are built with equity in mind. I mean, I have so much more to say, but I would love to pause there and check in.
I see we have a hand up from Nate.
Yes.
Thank you. This is very interesting. What's the relationship between these sorts of pilots and pilots in relation to nonprofit institutions that are tax exempt, like certain hospitals and universities, churches?
Yeah, very similar, actually. So it's interesting, some pilot agreements, and I think Boston has some interesting ones where there's like a collective agreement to share in those pilot payments. And then Louisville, for example, has it where the pilot payments were really a subsidy for a hospital or healthcare to buy properties that were going to be part of the development as a healthcare center. So we've seen both the pilots being used for nonprofits to be given as a subsidy, and then we've seen it used as a way to find some balance to the fact that a tax-exempt organization may be making huge profits. I think, like we've seen with some private universities and public universities around the country. I think money, and what's interesting, and I think this is something that often surprises, like community leaders, is that most of the fundraising that's happening in the muni market is happening from nonprofit organizations, right? And there's a lot of, there is still some for-profit borrowing, but I think many people are surprised that those are nonprofits that are also using this pilot exemption and getting some of those benefits, even though they may be making a lot of money in a certain community and could afford to pay taxes. We've also seen it. What's interesting is, I don't know if you've heard about the recent Bond Secures. It's a safety net hospital network. And something they did was they bought a hospital in a predominantly Black poor neighborhood, took it over for the benefits of federal subsidies, but then at the same time, they get all those benefits of being able to have pilots, right? So yeah, it's rampant.
Ian, you had a question?
Well, sorry. I just wanted to clarify, in Boston, where we do have a very formal pilot agreement, what Boston does is it there's 46 institutions that have over $15 million in property, and they are required, they're asked is the better word, to actually pay what would be the equivalent of 25% of their property tax, of which half of which is a community benefit. And you know, I don't want to take away from that conversation, but that's what the term means in Boston. And it's it's a formal program that actually covers Harvard and Beth Israel Hospital, like the big, really multinational hospital, you know, chains and universities. So I just wanted to clarify that because that has a particular piece. And I mean, we're involved in the campaign to make that stronger. But I just wanted to clarify because that's what in Boston, when people hear pilot, that's a lot of the history, which is a little different from what you're talking with. Sorry.
Yeah. I mean, I think there are ways that I think the way it's done in Boston is more progressive in ways and more thoughtful around how contribution can be shared as a group. I think what's interesting, like, you know, I remember BC kind of not paying what they were agreed to pay. And it does seem like the level of accountability still kind of falls short of what we kind of need. And I'm curious of what happened with BC on that, like, and when people don't meet their pilot payment agreements.
Yeah,
discussion.
Well, no, actually, I was actually going to ask Enid if you don't mind, and I know we have a couple of hands up. I was actually going to ask. I did put the link to the pilot action group in the chat, and I'll put it in again. But I was going to ask if you don't mind, kind of giving some of the people in the room who may not be aware of the current campaign and the demands, if you mind giving a quick overview.
Sure. I didn't want to take away from the conversation. Just
not at all. I think it's elevating it.
Okay, so citywide, we've been involved for 4 years to try to strengthen the pilot program. Some of you have, you know, on a separate thing, have been invited to a strategy meeting. There's a big hearing coming up in the city. Our big demands are a new pilot commission, that the program should be rewritten, that there needs to be strategic investment on community benefits, and the institutions should be encouraged strongly to pay. We also won that the city had to revalue all the properties. So the assessment was done on 2008 property rates, and now it's done on 2022 rates of property, which those of us who are property owners in the city of Boston know that 2008 was the recession. 2022 is a much more valued years. And then we also have state legislation, because I saw somebody put something in here about Medford that would make pilot payment mandatory if a city actually voted to do it. And we think it actually meets constitutional muster because it basically looks at it as a fee for services that is rendered, because approximately 25% of a town's budget is services like firefighting, snow removal. So a longer conversation, and I really didn't want to take from it, but that's where it is. So if people want to find out about the state and the city, I can put my email here, and didn't want to take away. So that's basically very quick summary.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I saw another hand up, Louise and Hannah.
What I'll say is a lot of it, inclusionary, isn't just with the businesses, the pilots. Like, I'm in neighborhood groups, a lot of people. And when they have a new project for the inclusionary funding, the neighborhoods get a say, not only if they follow what we say. It's and what the activist groups, I say, they're not giving enough. We still feel they're not giving enough power and listening to the people enough. And what we say is they have a too small percentage for affordable. A lot of the too small percentage for affordable housing. And when some of the developers, when they go affordable housing, they're doing the upper end of affordability. They're not really poor. And we're protesting to get it for like 30% of the median income, because they use the median income for greater Boston area, which is high. And I wonder, like she's saying about that, a lot of it is community based, and a lot activist groups and involved and community groups are always saying what they want with it. And of course, some community groups might be exclusive with something and different things, but what we say, we don't really feel they're really giving that much. And I wonder what you think of that.
Yeah, no, I hear you on that. I think I've been doing this work in New Jersey, looking at different parts of New Jersey and different municipalities and what kind of affordable housing rules they've implemented across the state in different municipalities. And I think what we are seeing is that affordability rules in the most urban areas are still not affordable. And this pushback to, and I think it directly connects to pilots, because I think if we're part of the participatory budgeting process, right, which I think is great that places in Boston are open to and are practicing that, then we should be part of the expense part of it too, right? And be able to decide if we're going to give a pilot to a developer, then it should really truly be affordable for the entire community. And I think to have that, you have to have more of the community involved in the conversation. And I do think participatory budgeting is like a great way to start having that conversation about one portion of it that I think could build a bridge to the other. And then the knowledge of just how much money we are giving away. Like, I think it's great that the valuations were updated, because then you can really have a conversation about what kind of taxes are really being foregone when we give a pilot, or make an area designated to give a subsidy to a developer. I agree with you. And I think those things can be challenged. And there's an organization in New Jersey that goes and basically sues different communities, housing boards, to try to create a greater, like a lower affordability housing basis or base. And so I'm like kind of excited to see that in some ways moving in New Jersey a little bit. And I think you'll see it in other places. And I think as more people get knowledgeable about like what's being given to a developer, it's harder and harder to not have it be inclusionary for everyone there.
Hannah, I think you had a question.
Yeah, and I think it follows on that. I was wondering if you could share a little bit more about some of the ways that communities have helped earmark some of those funds for community priorities and had the most kind of effective processes for that. But I'm interested in the that idea around how do you enforce a pilot, because I live up on the North Shore, actually, in Beverly, and we have a hospital and 2 college campuses that fall under that nonprofit category. And they do have pilots with the city that I don't think have been updated or negotiated in, I don't know, probably 2 decades, maybe more, and don't come through every year. And they just kind of end up in the general budget. They're not tied to any specific community goals. They just go into the general pot of funds. I'm curious what others' experiences.
Yeah, I think one was I worked on Cambridge offering when I was at Neighborly, and part of the idea behind it was to use the participatory budgeting amount that was allocated for the city and to borrow for it, have the community actually invest in the bonds, right? Basically pay for your own infrastructure, which is, what we are doing anyway. And I thought that was really successful in getting people interested in the dialogue around like, what are we spending this on? How is it working? And I thought some interesting things got raised, where the city manager may have wanted to do different infrastructure projects. Things like bike lanes got raised to the top because the community was involved. It was interesting. It was very much low tech, but very impactful infrastructure that the community really raised their hand and said, this is what we wanted. And I thought it was really powerful to be able to see that, to be able to hear what people really wanted. And it was very different than I think what sometimes happens. And then, I think, that's one example of how I think being part of the whole process can kind of start to like stimulate some of that change. And then you asked a question around pilots and the same thing. Could you repeat that part for me?
I think this is for you, Hannah, if you're still here. Oh, looks like
I lost her.
Well, I see it looks like she's on the phone, maybe.
Oh, okay. Does anybody remember what this?
Sorry.
It's
Sorry,
okay, no worries.
I was making my way back through like 4 different screens.
No, it's okay.
Just as others were saying on the nonprofit institutions, like not coming through with their commitments or not updating them.
Yeah.
So I, my
Oh,
evening job, I'm
yeah.
a city councilor here in Beverly, so I've been sort of asking around, like, how do we make this happen? Talk about, linking the value of the land, the community benefits, and the community costs too of hosting some of these institutions that contribute a lot, but also, use resources in the community. So just getting that balance right, and how do you have that conversation effectively?
Yeah, I think one, having the numbers. So, having the updated valuations, which helps. Then you're talking about a base that is really showing what the real tax base is. And then I think also having what the surrounding areas are doing in terms of abatements. You might find that there's an abatement at your municipal level for the same organization that happening at the county level, happening somewhere else. And there may be like a lot of cross multiplication of this happening. And so I think like just understanding what is happening around you in terms of the same things, in terms of tax payments by nonprofits, healthcare particularly, and I think universities as well. I think those two things really help to start to have a conversation around accountability. And I mean, there's so many, I hate to say that some of the healthcare, not safety net hospitals do abuse like not for profit status. And I think in those cases, it kind of shows up in the strangest places in the care for people that are uninsured, or, don't have cash. And so I think in those places, like the impact they're actually having on the community and getting back to looking at like, is it equitable service that is being provided,
Oh.
Go ahead, Nia. You got a question?
Yeah, thank you, Homero. And forgive me if this is repetitive. I had to step away for a moment, and I feel like what I came back in on, you might have already been addressing this, and maybe there were flavors of what I'm about to ask in Hannah's question. But I just want to make sure I understand what I think maybe Activest's position, also just taking, for example, Enid's clarification into mind. So I think what I'm understanding is when we think broadly about pilots, payment in lieu of taxes, it's been would it be correct to say it's been a general history of a tool that cities or other types of localities have used primarily to the benefit of themselves and developers or businesses or maybe some other kind of large nonprofit institutions. And one critique I think I'm hearing that Activist may have had is we've not necessarily seen benefits accrue to communities through that process because it's occurred as a bit of a tax break. Yes, it brings in revenue, but it brings in less revenue than just paying taxes would. And then bringing in this piece of the campaign in Boston, where we have a pilot program, and we also have a campaign that's saying, hey, we have this program, and not every institution that is supposed to participate is participating to their full potential. And so there's a lot of revenue being left on the table. And so I'm curious if for you would say, with the critique that Activist has, part of it is also about, I guess, who has access to a tool like Pilot,
Yes,
how it can be used, and to whose benefit. So I just wanted to hear a little more about that, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I agreed with like 98% of how you summarized it. I think the 2% part that I don't think communities really get the benefit. Like, I don't think they're using it to benefit themselves as much as city leaders, and hopefully there's no mayors on here, but like city leaders use it to get the wealthy to be a part of, to share in social capital, political capital, capital. And so I find that it's less that the communities like all as a total is benefiting from it, but more it's being used as barter to keep like really powerful, wealthy people, institutions incentivized to invest in communities. And so, yeah, so tell me, and then the second part you said was,
And then, so, yeah, and then I think the second part is, and so then is maybe a promise of pilot given that history. And I'm actually on this, in this regard, kind of curious, which I probably should know a little more about the history of the pilot program in Boston, actually, how that originated, if it was a similar premise. But then if there's more promise, if more people, if more communities and more community members, for example, aside from city leaders and aside from business leaders and aside from nonprofit leaders, are able to access access as a tool, does it become a better instrument? And then just really quickly with that, I'm thinking of a matrix Ryan showed us last week, and I don't know if you're familiar with that matrix where it had rent control, it had pilot, it had participatory budgeting, and I can't remember all of the components of the matrix, but there was definitely, I think, an equity component, there was a financial outcomes component.
Yeah.
And this is why I asked, why it seems like Activist definitely has a critique, because the pilot piece was, it was not in the high equity, high financial outcomes portion of the matrix. And that was actually a little surprising to me. So yeah,
I think I that's spot on. I think the challenge that we've seen is that pilots haven't come with the equity framework in order to analyze on a, the same way we'd make another return on investment analysis on dollars in. I don't find that pilots are doing the same thing. There's no process in place that's really centering equity, centering how what displacement will look like. Find it's very much centered on tax revenue. And some communities, and I think some mayors, frankly, find it easier to just switch out their residents for higher paying residents and consider that to be growth. And I think pilots have been used as an effective way to do that. I do think there is opportunity in pilots to do something different. I think the opportunity to use an equity framework and really build around this idea of like having lots of people have access to do it, right? I think if pilots weren't just happening by Amazon and they were happening by cooperative supermarkets, we'd be having a very different conversation. And I think that's where the challenge lies, is that access. And I think it also is true for many Black cities. I think I work with Jackson, Mississippi a lot, and something they're seeing is people really the state, the county, like it's the craziest thing, private entities around them, because they don't have any cash, they're showing up to try to buy their assets. So like the state's like, I'll buy your park, I'll buy your reservoir. And they're like, but we need that. Like what do we do after this? And so they're really trying to resist, but they don't have access to do a pilot, right? There's no one that wants to do a pilot, there's no access. Everyone wants to show them a cash bid. And so I think that's part of the challenge as well. It's like, you have to have access to be able to do it, the political savvy to do it. And then if you could raise the money in the muni market and do it, it's just like a home run for everyone. And so access to capital markets, I think, is also a part of it. Because pilots are their own muni bonds usually, and they're an easy muni bond to structure because you can see exactly who's supposed to pay it and know what their commitment is.
Thank you, Homero. I'm just pointing out, Enid's put in the chat, we have fought for the last few years to strategically use a racial justice lens for the community benefit dollars, and our campaign specifically fights for expanded community engagement.
Yeah, I think it's so needed. And I'm curious of what the feedback's been like.
Well, our mayor, when Walsh was mayor in the first year of the pandemic following the death of George, the murder of George Floyd, he specifically talked about racism being a public health crisis. And we've always used that framework. We've always talked about investment in social determinants of health. That's what hospitals should be doing. That's what universities should be doing. We have a framework in Massachusetts that has been defined by the attorney general. So we have a lot of that. We just can't get the city there.
I know, I hear you.
So
I hear you.
that's the answer.
Yeah.
And just to answer Nita's question about pilot, when Menino was mayor, which was 20 years ago, he got pissed off at the hospitals for basically not taking care of poor people, and that's how community benefits started in Massachusetts, because Harshbarger, when he was the attorney general, was pissed off that the Brigham and Mass General were sitting on sitting on billions of dollars in assets and dumping people at what was Boston City. So that's how community benefits started. And then Menino went one step further when the hospital, when I think it was Mass General was going to move its facility headquarters to Somerville. And he said, you can't freaking do that. And he started to shake the hospitals and universities down for money. And that's exactly what he did. Then it became more formal. There was a commission, there was framework, but he had the political chutzpah, to use the term, to tell you Harvard and all these other institutions that you're in my city and you need to contribute.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. And I think those are the ways that it is a great step in the right direction for a nonprofit or a large entity that isn't contributing anything in terms of taxes. I think it's a good step to get something on paper, actually get revenues in the door.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, we're at close to 7:05. Homero, I don't know if you had anything else you want to share, if anyone had any questions, but we have about 10 more minutes in our workshop before we close it out, but just want to flag that.
Can I ask,
Go ahead, sorry.
ask one more question? From a fiscal justice perspective, what is a locality that you would uplift or hold up and say, and that the activists would say, we like what's happening here from a fiscal justice perspective?
Yeah, I would say, I think there are pockets, I think I'm hard to find a whole place that's doing everything right, but I think there are pockets. I think, so I think DC is doing a lot of things right in terms of figuring out how to really focus on water and education, but a lot of displacement and gentrification, they're not doing everything right. And then I think there are places like Jackson, Mississippi is doing a lot of things right, but water is not right. And Flint, Michigan has learned so much from the past. And I think I would say that's one community I think is they're building infrastructure from scratch right now. And their water is back, and they are figuring out a way forward by using their community foundations to really hold the place that the city was not holding. And so those community foundations are bringing in their own equity analysis and using the tools they have used throughout their communities to really change how money is being allocated. And so I think in ways like that, they are doing things that are really right. But then they also have part-time funding that makes them miss ARPA dollars, you know what I mean? So so many things. I think, I think there are places that are doing parts right in terms of focusing on children and climate and criminal justice. And then I think there are still challenges with water and economic development, pilots and tax abatements, so yeah. I think overall, and I'm trying to think of other systems that I think are really doing a good job. I think HBCUs are doing it as a system, are figuring out how to serve students, masters, teachers, just really figuring out how to use all their services to do that in a way that I think is impressive. I'm finding that library systems, separately created library systems in communities. Flint is one too, has been interesting. It's almost like creating your own city around this idea of library infrastructure. And I think that is talk about a community doing something innovative, using the bond market to build stuff. And I think that's kind of interesting. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Louise, you had a question?
Yeah, I do. I have it because, what do you think? I feel that, when a nonprofit is doing pilots, very few people know about it. It's not, and how much outreach are they doing to the EJ communities, publishing it more? Because I think only a few people know it when a nonprofit going for a pilot. And so there are
Yeah.
only a few people, the in crowd, that's getting to say it. How much are they going to get the whole general public?
I completely agree. And I mean, pilots is one extreme of it, where it's definitely hush hush. And what's interesting is like some of these pilots are years in the works, right? And people have been making these economic development plans. You could see when they started putting in filings for zoning and testing EPA and testing the ground. And so like this stuff is in the works, right? And so I think this idea of it just being hush hush until it's time is a disservice to us as a community. I also think that translates to all the other parts. Like our financials are too hard to get. Like we should know all this. Our cities are not that big and complicated. Like we should be able to get all the financial information and the transparency to understand what our cities are doing with our dollars. And I think pilots is like the extreme of it. Like that is just not helpful to have the lack of transparency and no clarity and shared information. But I do think it's purposeful. And I think city leaders that are figuring out how to be more transparent and state leaders, I think people care and it's helpful. I agree, Louise.
Looks like Jenny, you have your hand up.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for a great conversation. You mentioned HBCUs, and I was wondering if you have other examples of how universities can be a more positive force in all of this, because so much of it, especially in Boston, the universities are really not contributing to the extent they should, and they're causing all kinds of, they're actually kind of extractive and exploitative in a lot of ways. So
yeah,
how can we, are there examples of like bigger change, and again, it might be like small pockets of some innovative things here and there. That's what I've seen, but are there any, other examples or ideas that you have about particularly transformation and how universities engage with cities?
Yeah. I mean, I think Howard University is an interesting one because they just released this master plan where they're basically going to try to like build out U Street, which is like right around where they are. And I think it's interesting that they are thinking about how to make it inclusive for the whole community. And while that neighborhood is being gentrified, it's interesting to see this like combining of a university trying to hold on to the historical kind of culture around it. So I think that's interesting when universities choose to be like, I'm trying to hold Boston down, right? Like I'm trying to really keep this place so that people can be a part of it and everyone can go to school here. And I just think things like that to me seems like a relatively easy step that really is huge. I think also, and it often happens in the places that have the most hardship, like the places that are doing great. Like I'm not seeing a lot of that, but like places like Flint, Eastern Michigan shows up with water, and then the tech lab is creating mobile water filtration systems, and there's this like collaboration to help solve the problems using these minds that are out here studying, the stuff that we need the most in innovation. I find that to be really helpful. But I see that in places like that, but don't see it at all in the difference between Palo Alto and East Palo Alto, and so I find that to be very like it's just places that get to choose it. Yeah. I think of also places I've seen some more universities being like extractive than the other. I think that example, especially around stadiums, and building sports stadiums. And I mean, that is like, yeah, that just rubs me the wrong way. It's like horrible. And cities usually on the hook for those payments, and it's just not fair. Yeah.
You want to ask that out loud, James? Was that you in the chat?
Yeah. Where's it at? Hold on.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I could. Yeah, oh, go ahead. Sorry, you please do. Please do.
Yeah, I think it's pretty direct. Yeah, just curious to know of any networks nationally or even regionally that are like really organizing and collaborating around this work.
Yeah. I could definitely think of a couple. I think the one I mentioned in Louisville is a good one. They're not specifically focused on this, but they're focused on how their community is being displaced, and that's showing up in a pilot. So I think there's ways that organizations that are pushing back on what is completely, sometimes it's just a full like takeover of a neighborhood, have found ways to use whatever kind of study they have or whatever analysis they use to also understand how a pilot is affecting them and impacting them. And so, yeah, I think I have a couple that I would love to introduce you to. And I think they are also looking for other ways to like expand. How do we challenge? I mean, the Louisville one is a perfect example because it's not done yet, and it's being challenged. And so they feel like they're actively in a fight to not have a developer take over their neighborhood. But the pilot's already been paid, which is, so, yeah.
Thank you, Homero. And I know Enid put her email address in the chat just for people who want to grab it. Just want to say again, because we're truly appreciative that you're here, Homero. That Homero's in Amsterdam. It is 1:15 where Homero is.
That's right.
So really appreciate that you are talking to us about pilots at 1:00 in the morning.
Yes.
Where you are. So thank you.
I appreciate the invite.
I'll throw it back to James to close us out.
Yes, thank you so much, Homero. And thank you all for joining us this evening. This has been a lovely workshop. I feel like I've learned a lot. Feel free to reach out to Homero or other people if you have any questions related to pilot. Would love to engage with you all.